push and start.
Good afternoon. Welcome to this month's Research Matters. I am Erica Salzik, and I am the Department Administrator for UT Southwestern's Human Research Protection Program. Before we jump into today's presentations, here are some general housekeeping items. First, if you have any questions for our presenters, please type them in the Q&A. One of our moderators will respond to you during the session, or we will address it at the end of the presentation. Second, this Research Matters session is being recorded and will be available immediately after the conclusion of this session. You may access the recording by clicking on the same link provided in the Outlook appointment. Shortly after the conclusion of this session, we will send out any slides and or handouts via the listserv, and you'll be able to access the recordings and documents on HRPP's Research Matters website, which can be found under the Training and Resources page. And finally, we provide a certificate of attendance to those who have logged in using a valid email address. This email will be sent separately from the listserv email and will only be sent to those who have logged in with a valid email address. As always, if you have any questions, please send an email to hrpp@utsouthwestern.edu. Here is today's agenda. We will begin with HRPP office updates, followed by a presentation on how to do record updates in clinicaltrials.gov, and then Joshua Fedua will present on data use and data transfer agreements. So now I'll turn it over to you, Josh.
Thank you, Erica. We have just one very quick update before we get to our presentation from Rosija on ct.gov. We just wanted to let everybody know that we have heard about the listserv website issues, that there's been problems getting access to the website to register or look at potentially old messages that have been sent out. We've talked with Information Resources here at UT Southwestern, and they've let us know that there's a chronic problem with the server that's hosting the listserv websites, and they are working to resolve that problem. But in the meantime, a quick solution is to use Firefox to open any listserv URL. In the meantime, if you have any subscription requests or any questions about the listserv that Firefox does not solve for you, please email hrpp@utsouthwestern.edu for help. With that, I'll turn it over to Rosija on her presentation for clinicaltrials.gov.
Thank you, Josh. So today I'm doing a session on how to do record updates. So welcome everyone. I am Rosija Nambiar and I work with Eriko Iwatate in the Regulatory Support Office in HRPP. In the last Research Matters, I had discussed regarding how to do annual updates. So today I'll continue with this how-to series and go over how to do the record updates. So let's get started. What is this about? So record updates are very similar to modifications. Why do we have to do it? Well, it's required by federal regulations. Just so you know, not doing record updates is also considered non-compliance. In fact, I just attended an IND-ID work group yesterday, which is run by CTSA Institution, where I got to know that one of their sponsor investigator was recently audited by the FDA, and the FDA requested the sponsor investigator to update the ct.gov record since their record was not up to date. So please keep in mind that if you are audited by the FDA, they will find out that you haven't updated your ct.gov record, which is considered non-compliance. So when do you have to do it? In general, at the time of protocol amendments. Operationally speaking, timing of record updates in ct.gov, submitting modification in ERB, and protocol amendment to FDA if sponsor investigator is IND-ID holder are almost exactly in parallel. Please note that our office provides assistance in each stage for both CT.gov reporting and IND IDE support. The regulations require that some data elements be updated more rapidly, as summarized in the table here. For example, recruitment status, primary completion date, etc. I just wanted to remind you that once you finish recruiting, you would change the recruitment status to active not recruiting. And at that time, you would need to upload one copy of the IRB approved version of unsigned consent form, which was used to enroll the participants in clinical trials conducted or supported by a common rule department or agency. I'm saying this because we have noticed that this consent form uploads have not been done consistently. In addition, if a protocol is amended in such a manner that changes are communicated to human subjects in the clinical trial, the regulations require that updates to any relevant clinical trial information be submitted not later than 30 calendar days after the protocol amendment is approved by the IRB. Next, coming to which kind of records require these frequent updates. It is required for all active records, regardless of funding source, that is applicable clinical trials, NIH-funded clinical trials, and for trials for which registration information was voluntarily submitted. Then finally, you would want to know how to do these record updates. I've created a step-by-step guide that will soon be available on our website. Now let's review these steps in the next few slides. This is a high-level overview, and I'll quickly go through each step explaining how to navigate through the system. The first step is to log into your PRS account with your username and password, as you see in the snapshot here. If you don't have an account or encounter any issues logging in since you have forgotten your username or password, then please email us and we'll help you get it set up. Then the next step is to click on the open link on the left-hand side of your ct.gov page in order to open your record. Once you are on the record summary page, click on the open link on the left-hand side to go within the protocol section to do the record updates. The next step is to open each specific section that needs to be updated within the record. In the next few slides, I've tried to show some examples of these record updates. This is a slide showing an example of overall recruitment status update. You would need to click Edit to go into that specific section. As shown in this bottom image, you would click on the drop-down arrow to update the overall recruitment status of the trial. This would need to be made within 30 calendar days after the change has occurred. Similarly, you would go to the Sponsor Collaborator section to update the responsible party field if there is a change in PI, as shown in this bottom image here. This slide shows an example of the oversight section that may need to be updated if there are any changes, like updating your IRB approval status. Updates to the eligibility section includes updates like changes to the inclusion or exclusion criteria. Once you save all the changes that need to be made, you can click on the record summary link on the left-hand side corner that takes you to the main record summary page as shown on the next slide. Then you click this Entry Complete button that you will find on the main record summary page. The final step is to request the responsible party, that is a PI, to review the complete record, as the responsible party must verify the accuracy of the clinical trial information being submitted, and then click the green Approve and Release buttons to submit the record for ct.gov review. So again, to summarize, these steps will help you easily do your record updates. If you still have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. Many of you know we maintain all records compliance. I'm going to quickly present our monthly metrics. As you see here, with everyone's efforts, we are able to achieve 100% compliance since January, as per the FEDA non-compliance trial tracker website. And in September too, we were able to maintain 100% compliance. Again, important to note that this 100% compliance is for FDA regulated applicable clinical trials only and does not include NIH funded trials that are not applicable clinical trials or trials that are voluntarily registered. This is our monthly metrics, which shows overall real-time compliance for all UT Southwestern records. Our goal is to keep the problem records as low as we can. The FEDA problem records are indicated here as red. The non-FEDA problems are indicated as orange, while the green ones are the records with no problems, and the blue indicates the total number of records. Here is a list of resources for your reference, and we also provide training in person if you need any help doing these kind of updates. This is my last slide. Here is a selected list of resources that would be helpful for you. And at Next Research Matters, we are starting with our next series of how to avoid major comments. Thank you all for your time listening to me, and I'll take some questions if you have, or you can always email us and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. Thank you. Over to you, Josh.
Thank you, Razija. While we're waiting for some questions to come in, I did want to just be absolutely clear for the research community, because this is a new requirement with the new common rule about the posting requirement for consent documents. So this applies to any study that is supported by a common rule supported agency. So that includes any of the agencies that have signed on to the common rule, and there's a list online, and we can always clarify that list specifically for you, but it includes the NIH and about 18 to 19 other agencies that have signed on to the new common rule. It also, the posting requirement only applies to the prime awardee of that federal supported study. It is not for all sites, for every site, for each PI. It is only for the prime awardee. So that would only be instances where UT Southwestern is the prime awardee for these studies. We will also be presenting about this consent upload requirement at a future Research Matters. So stay tuned for that, because we are currently looking at our policies, procedures, and really looking at how we can best support the research community here at UT Southwestern. There is a question in the chat. Would a survey type research study on an educational intervention be something we need to register with ct.gov? Razija, do you want to answer that question for the community?
So we would need to look into the specific protocol, so you can always email us and we can take a look at that specific protocol that you're asking, and we can respond accordingly.
Okay, thank you, Razija. So with that, just in the interest of time, and because I anticipate that we'll have more questions coming in, we'll try to address any questions either via the chat function directly or publish them. And if there's more questions, we can always address them after we get through this next part of the presentation. So we'll be talking next about data use and data transfer agreements. What, when, and how. And so as part of the presentation, what we're going to be talking through is what are data use agreements? When will UT Southwestern require agreements to send or receive data? And how will the UT Southwestern HRPP be processing agreements? So a DUA is an agreement that establishes who's permitted to use and receive a limited data set. And I've put the limited data set words in red and included all of this language, even though I'm not going to cover all of it, because I wanted to be absolutely clear that we use the term data use agreement very freely within the research world, just to describe really any time data might be flowing between different institutions. But according to HIPAA, a data use agreement is a very specific type of agreement. It's a defined agreement within the regulations. So a data use agreement, when we're talking about the type of agreement we should process for a study, really only applies to, again, when we are sending or receiving a limited data set. A data use agreement requires all these things be addressed. But I just wanted to make it very clear what a data use agreement is. And now the next question that you're probably all thinking is, okay, what is a limited data set? Well, a limited data set is a data set that contains only the following PHI. So it contains dates, like a date of admission, a date of service, when was a CT scan completed. It can include date of birth, city, state, or 5-digit zip code. So you can not get more specific with a particular location of a participant, or ages in years, months, days, or hours. So a limited data set is not a de-identified data set. It is a very specific type of data set that includes any of these 3 elements of PHI. And I've included a reference here from Hopkins. They have a really nice website relating to limited data sets and DUAs, so you can go there and take a look at the link. I apologize that it's so long on the bottom. But when we're talking, again, I mentioned that we use the term data use agreement pretty freely. So what other type of agreements might we be processing when we're talking through research studies? We might be processing a material transfer agreement. So that's going to be any agreement where UT Southwestern is sending or receiving samples, and that may include data or may not include data. It may be purely just here's the samples. We could also process a data transfer agreement. And so this is going to be any agreement to send de-identified data. And you might also hear the term a business associates agreement. And that really is, again, an agreement defined by HIPAA, and that is to allow the permissible uses or disclosures of PHI beyond a limited data set. In the context of research, it's not going to be too often that will be working through a business associate agreement, because this usually applies to some level of service that one institution is providing to another, and you can see that within the definition. Many times what we are going to refer to when we're talking about PHI beyond those 3 that were identified as part of a limited data set will really be allowed by a consent form, and or consent form and HIPAA authorization. And we'll get to that in just a second. So why are we talking about this? Well, for many of you, you know that prior to April of 2021, UT Southwestern required that a data agreement for any data received or sent when it was coming to UT Southwestern. And that was pretty onerous. The problem with that requirement is that the data agreement may or may not conflict with the, it may conflict with whether or not an agreement is actually required. And so we might be going through the process of requiring an agreement when it's not actually required by any law or regulation. That agreement may also conflict with the HIPAA authorization that's signed by the participant. So the participant may say this is the level of information and data that can be shared with another entity, and then a data agreement may put restrictions, and that's not appropriate if the participant has already given HIPAA authorization. And it may conflict with the approved HIPAA waiver that the IRB/Privacy Board has reviewed and approved as part of the study. So if we're talking about when an agreement may or may not be required, it really makes sense to look at what are the regulations that define when an agreement should be processed. So here's really, we go back to HIPAA. HIPAA governs the uses and disclosures of any protected health information. And according to HIPAA, there's 3 ways that we can document that authorization to use or disclose PHI in clinical research. The first is that HIPAA authorization was obtained from the research participant. So anytime that we are obtaining consent or HIPAA authorization, any newer study, you know that we include the HIPAA authorization language right within the consent document. Older studies, that's why it was so important that both consent and HIPAA authorization be obtained at the time that the participant agreed to participate in the study. So the HIPAA authorization will define what level of PHI can be sent, what health information can be sent, and who it's going to go to. In addition, the HIPAA regulations define that a waiver of HIPAA authorization from the IRB or the Privacy Board could also authorize the disclosure of PHI to another covered entity, as HIPAA refers to it. The third way that this could be allowed for under HIPAA is when we're talking about a limited data set, the institution could execute a DUA with another institution to allow for that transfer or disclosure of the limited data set. So moving forward, keeping in mind these regulations, when will UT Southwestern require an agreement for data with or without specimens? And so this, I know that this is a very small view of this decision tree, but this decision tree will be uploaded to the HRPP website, and it really reflects the decision points of when will a DUA, a data use agreement, or a data transfer agreement, again, a data transfer agreement meaning de-identified data, when will it be required? And so for the next couple of slides, we're going to zoom in on some of these questions within the decision tree. And I just want to point out that we're going to start with this overall question. Is the data to be transferred identifiable? And our decision tree that's going to be on the website defines those 18 HIPAA identifiers. But the future slides, I'm not going to include all this language, but these 18 HIPAA identifiers should not be new or surprising names, addresses, dates, ages over the age of 89, blah, blah, blah. So we're starting with this question as we go through the slide. Is the data to be transferred identifiable? So starting off, when that question answered is yes. So if the data to be transferred is identifiable, the first question that we're going to be asking, and that's where the number 1 just popped up, is was patient authorization obtained for this disclosure? If the answer to that question is yes, then because authorization was obtained, a data use agreement is not required. So that really requires not just that we're looking at did HIPAA authorization get documented as part of the initial review, but did that authorization allow for this disclosure to this entity? So if we have a data use agreement that gets submitted in e-agreements to send something to the University of North Carolina, we need to go back and we need to look at that HIPAA authorization and look to see, was the University of North Carolina included in the HIPAA authorization language, along with was the data that's being proposed as part of this agreement included in the HIPAA authorization? So it's a simple question, but it requires more than just looking at was authorization obtained, but obtained for this disclosure. So we need to be very clear about that. If the answer to that is no, the HIPAA authorization didn't include the entity or the level of data that's being proposed to be shared, the next question is, did the IRB or Privacy Board waive HIPAA authorization for this disclosure? So if the answer to that is yes, because the IRB or Privacy Board has waived authorization for this disclosure to the unique entity or the amount of data that needs to be shared, then a DUA, again, will not be required. If the answer to that question is no, then the next question that we're going to ask is PHI limited to what you're seeing here as the limited data set, geographic subdivisions smaller than a state, or elements of dates, except for year related to a particular patient. If the answer to that is yes, then we're talking about truly what HIPAA defines as what's appropriate for a data use agreement, and we'll use the UT Southwestern DUA template to send out to the other institution and negotiate the terms of this transfer. If the answer to that is no, because either the study team is proposing to use something more than a limited data set, then a DUA is not an appropriate process to document this transfer. If a study team is proposing to transfer more than a limited data set, a fully identifiable data set, then authorization from the participant must be obtained, including the unique entity and the amount of data that the disclosure includes, or the IRB must approve a waiver to share that PHI. And we'll go through that just a little bit more in regards to what it means for new studies. But this is really the decision tree for any identifiable data set that you're looking to send out, whether it's identifiable data set because it's a limited data set or more than a limited data set. So going back to the first question and answering no, this is a de-identified data set. The first thing that we have, just to make it clear on our decision tree, is that because this is a de-identified data set, HIPAA does not apply, and so we don't need to process a data use agreement. Again, data use agreement is a defined agreement from HIPAA. The next question, though, that we're going to be asking as part of this is the data being transferred to a commercial or an international entity? And if the answer to that question, or I'm sorry, I'm missing my numbers here. So the first thing, like I said, is HIPAA does not apply. Second thing is we're going to ask if the data is being transferred to commercial or international entity. If the answer to that is no, we're sending it to a nonprofit United States entity, then we are not going to, UT Southwestern is not going to require a data transfer agreement. Now I need to be very clear, UT Southwestern is not going to require a data use agreement, and we'll come back to why I'm being so specific with that in just a bit. The next question, though, is if you are sending this to a commercial or international entity, is whether or not there's an agreement already in place at UT Southwestern that outlines the transfer to that entity. So if we have a clinical trial agreement for a sponsored study, then we will not require a data transfer agreement. It could be something other than a clinical trial agreement, though. It could be a service agreement, a CRA. There's a lot of agreement types and e-agreements that you might have already processed with another office that defines that this data, this de-identified data set, is going to be provided to this entity. And if you already have that agreement, just make that clear for the HRPP, and then at that point we will say a data transfer agreement unique to this particular disclosure is not required. However, if the answer to that is no, we are sending this to a commercial entity or an international entity, we don't already have an agreement in place, then UT Southwestern will use our data transfer agreement template to process this data transfer. And so I know that's a lot of information, and so we have a nice summary slide here for all of you that hopefully will be super helpful as you're referring back to this. The first point is that a data transfer agreement is required when we're sending de-identified data to an international or for-profit entity. A DTA, a data transfer agreement, will not be required for de-identified data going to a United States nonprofit entity. But it's important to note this is not part of the decision tree because that decision tree is unique to whether or not an agreement is required. It's important to note that the transfer of that data must be part of the IRB approved protocol. So you must have already noted this inside your study within eIRB. A data use agreement will be required when the use or disclosure is not authorized by the participant. The IRB/Privacy Board, we are the IRB and Privacy Board, has not waived authorization for that use or disclosure. And you're talking about a limited data set. If you're talking about transferring more than a limited data set, an identifiable data set for research purposes, then you either need to obtain HIPAA authorization from the participants or ask the IRB/Privacy Board for a waiver. We cannot authorize a transfer of identifiable data through some sort of data use or data transfer agreement. So as part of this, one of the other changes that's going to happen, and this started in July of 2021, is that the Human Research Protection Program Department will process data use agreements and data transfer agreements involving human data. I want to be clear that we will only be processing these agreements when UT Southwestern is providing and receiving the data. And the reason that we're being very specific to that is usually when UT Southwestern is receiving data from the external institution, that external institution is providing their agreement template, and that expertise to assess whether that template meets with UT Southwestern standards really lives in another office. You might be asking, why is the HRPP going to be processing agreements? So the reason why we're going to be doing this is we can help assess whether or not there's a need for an agreement. So we can go through that decision tree with you and really determine, is this agreement required according to regulation? We can ensure congruency between the study and the agreements. And so if you have processed an agreement in the past 2 years, you might have gotten a comment from the HRPP that indicated that while the agreement wanted to send data out, the study was not in line with whatever the agreement included, and the study needed to be modified. We can work to ensure the congruency between those two things while we're in the midst of reviewing a new study, or make sure that any modification is processed as quickly as possible. And so that turns into a quick turnaround for that congruency check, but hopefully also a very quick turnaround for any data use agreement or data transfer agreement. If the other institutions don't require any changes and respond quickly to our template request of their review of that, then we can process these as soon as possible. It's always, of course, up to the other institution to let us know if they have any questions, and if they do, that may slow down the process. So moving into what you should be doing as you're thinking about new studies, is that as you're submitting a new study in EIRB, think about whether or not any data, identifiable data especially, is going to be disclosed to another outside entity. And if it is, make it absolutely clear in that informed consent document or HIPAA authorization, if you're obtaining that, how the PHI will be used and disclosed. If you're not going to be obtaining informed consent / HIPAA authorization, and you'll be requesting a waiver of HIPAA authorization, then make sure that Form H includes the disclosures between the covered entities. And so I apologize, I meant to update this slide. I updated the next slide, but I forgot that I put it here. We are in the midst of updating Form H, our HIPAA authorization waiver form, so that it's easier for you to document these disclosures between covered entities. We're very close to having a finalized version. We'll publish it to the website as soon as it's done, but just yesterday we identified what we think will be a quicker and easier way for you to put this into the form than what it was previously. This will allow you to be very clear how data is being sent out if you're talking about some level of identifiable data. This includes, at time of new study, to be clear, not just identifiable data, but it also could be a limited data set. So if you're sending any level of identifiable data, make sure that you're being clear on Form H, the PHI that's being transferred either from Parkland to UT Southwestern or Children's to UT Southwestern. We are unique institutions, therefore those disclosures must be approved by the IRB, as well as from UT Southwestern potentially to a collaborating entity. If we're talking about sending just a completely de-identified data set, include that in EIRB Section 24. If you're talking about sending it to a for-profit entity or to an international entity, then simultaneously, this is when for new studies, you'll want to submit your request in e-agreements for a data transfer agreement. So just to touch very quickly on what some of those Form H revisions will look like. One thing that we've done is we've split Form H into three separate forms, and those three separate forms really request the three types of HIPAA authorization waivers you could request. A full waiver, you will never look to obtain HIPAA authorization from the participants. A partial waiver for recruitment purposes, or an alteration request because you'll be obtaining verbal HIPAA authorization, or you're looking to change one of the elements of HIPAA authorization. By splitting these questions out, we think that you'll be getting more specific questions and more specific template answers pertinent to each waiver type. So the HIPAA authorization or the alteration for HIPAA authorization waiver form will be much shorter than the full or the partial, which is really nice, make it easier for you to fill it out. We've already required for multiple types of waiver requests that we would need multiple form submissions, because it's very hard for you and for us to document why you might be asking for both a partial waiver and a full waiver on the same study, what types of data you're going to need unique to each. And so this will make it easier for you to say, for my partial waiver, this is what I need. For my full waiver, this is what I need. And like I said, they will be released as soon as possible on our website, as soon as we are assured that really the questions are formatted so that they're understandable and easy for all of you to complete. So as a summary for new studies, in most instances, UT Southwestern is not going to require an agreement, because either upfront you're going to be asking the participant to authorize the disclosure, you're going to be asking the IRB or privacy board to waive the requirement for the participant to sign this, and so we will be authorizing the disclosure on Form H. Or you're talking about a de-identified data set that's going to a nonprofit, again, that needs to be part of your IRB approved protocol, so that needs to be documented inside eIRB. Instances where we will require an agreement include a de-identified data set that is going to a nonprofit, and they require an agreement to receive the data. So this is some of the instances that we've seen in the past couple of months as the HRPP has been processing these, is that we're working with other academic medical centers or other institutions from around the country, and we let them know that per regulation, we do not require a data transfer agreement to send them the data, but they require an agreement to receive the data. In instances like that, we're going to defer to using that other institution's agreement template, because it will hopefully make negotiations a little bit quicker. And we'll also defer to the Office of Technology Development, OTD, to process that agreement. Again, they have the expertise to review those templates and confirm that their language does not conflict with anything that UT Southwestern would require. We would also require an agreement where a de-identified data set is going to a for-profit company or an international company. With regards to modifications, so as we're talking about a study and your PI comes to you and says, I've got this new collaboration that I want to set up with a PI at the University of Michigan or Northwestern University or a company. As we're talking about potentially saying that this new collaboration is going to include de-identified data, the first thing to think about is that if this process is not currently approved, if it's not part of the study in eIRB, the first step is to submit a modification eIRB to request approval for this data transfer. The reason that this is so important is that in cases where maybe you've obtained some level of consent or HIPAA authorization from the participants, you may have told them upfront that their data will be shared, but it will be limited in its sharing to this type of data or these types of institutions. And so the IRB needs to review this new protocol activity to confirm that it will be allowed. And if you're sending the de-identified data set to a commercial or international entity, then you need to submit that agreement in e-agreements and include the DUA number in section 24 of eIRB. This will make it very easy for us to do that congruency check to make sure that the two are lining up. For a limited data set that you are looking to send after the study has been approved, because the study has already been approved, this is really where HIPAA defines that a data use agreement is most appropriate. It's not appropriate necessarily to go back and ask the participants to authorize this disclosure because the law recognizes that can be a significant burden on both the study team, on the participants, and this is allowable within the law. So you'll want to submit that DUA request within e-agreements, and again, submit a modification in eIRB to document the activity in section 24 if it's not currently allowed. The last set of data that you might be looking to send out after a study has already been approved is identifiable data. And again, going back to, we cannot process an agreement or the, just an agreement for this. What you'll need to do for any identifiable data leaving UT Southwestern is to submit a modification to either update the HIPAA authorization form and indicate how you're going to obtain HIPAA authorization from all the enrolled participants who will be affected by this transfer, or submit a new HIPAA waiver request, justify why this is necessary for the study, and document that activity within Section 24. So it's also important just to summarize who's going to own the agreements within e-agreements. And so as we're talking about data transfer agreements, the HRPP will own those if UT Southwestern is providing and receiving. So if UT Southwestern is sending data or sending and receiving data, then the HRPP will process that agreement for you. We will also process any data use agreements where we are providing and receiving. I have the asterisk here just to note, especially in the case of data transfer agreements, if a non-UT Southwestern agreement template will be utilized, then HRPP will defer that agreement over to OTD. OTD will process the agreements for any data transfer agreements where we are receiving the data, or in instances where you are providing and receiving data. We will not require the agreement, but the external entity does. And so that will be part of the HRPP review, is that we will confirm with you that no agreement is required. And if that external entity comes back and says we need an agreement in place, then we'll get that agreement and kick it over to the OTD office for them to review. They will also process any DUAs where we are receiving the data, or we have already confirmed potentially that the HIPAA authorization language covers this transfer of a limited data set. We've seen some instances where other institutions still want an agreement in place, even though HIPAA has defined that no agreement is required. And if that's the case, then HRPP will defer it over to OTD. It's also important to note that aside from the slide where we define the types of agreements, HRPP will not be processing any MTAs, and that's why we haven't touched on it. OTD will continue to process any material transfer agreements, so an agreement where any specimens are going to be leaving UT Southwestern or coming to UT Southwestern. OTD will continue to process those and consult with the IRB when it's appropriate to confirm that that study or that's an approved protocol activity. So that was a lot of information, and I anticipate that there's probably some questions. And I see that there's been some questions that have already been answered. Any new questions that we can address?
Hi, yes, we do have one question for you.
Okay.
And if a PI has an MTA, is a DUA also required?
That's a great question. So if the MTA is already existing and has already been executed, and you're talking about new data, then really what we need to look at is what data are you talking about sending and how would we process that agreement. However, if that MTA has not been processed, it has not been executed by the two institutions, and you're talking about sending data and samples together, then that MTA can cover both the samples and the data within one agreement.
Thank you. Right now, I don't have any. Oh, we do have something come through. So it says typically the study contract with the study industry sponsor includes language relating to data use. Will the HRPP need to review the specific language?
No, we will not. So that is a great question. So usually we're going to see that with some sort of clinical trial agreement. Again, we could be talking about something other than a clinical trial agreement. I know in that question, the person referred to study sponsor. We might also be talking about a service that another institution is going to provide, and so that might be like a service-related agreement. We will not need to review that language because it is that's accepted language that UT Southwestern knows and will negotiate as part of those agreements. It's also worth noting that with many clinical trials that are industry sponsored, most likely the consent document and HIP authorization include the transfer of data to the sponsor. And so that right there, according to HIPAA, allows that data to be transferred outside of UT Southwestern and or our affiliates.
Thank you. We have another one coming through. They want to confirm something. So it says, I just want to confirm if we will be sending specimens and a limited data set. We will fill out an e-agreement form, and in the background, HRPP or OTD will determine who will take ownership.
That is correct, yes. So if you're sending specimens, right up front, I can tell you that that agreement is going to be processed by the Office of Technology Development. As of right now, within e-agreements, we go in and we both take a look at agreements and we assign them to each other based on what I just showed on the last slide. There is an enhancement coming to e-agreements that will automatically assign the appropriate office, OTD versus HRPP, upon your submission. But again, right up front, I can say based on that, the fact that you're talking about specimens that will be processed by OTD. I also want to point out that the most recent newsletter that went out this morning, the Clinical Research Update newsletter, included the DUA updates. And so if you did not get that, please let us know, because we want to make sure that anybody who needs to get that newsletter is included in that list. But that also included some really great information about data use agreements and data transfer agreements.
Okay, I have another question for you.
Mm-hmm.
If we are sharing data with another nonprofit institution and all the data is de-identified and does not include a limited data set, we do not need a DUA, correct?
That could be correct. So you're talking about another institution, nonprofit. That could be an international institution. And if it's an international institution, then an agreement would be required. The other thing to just point out is that we want to be very clear what is de-identified data. And so as you're talking about this inside EIRB, or if you do submit an agreement within e-agreements and you just tell us de-identified data, we are going to require that you tell us the data elements that you're talking about sending. So that way we can confirm that this really does represent a de-identified data set. So this is all very clear as we're talking through this now, but it's very easy to forget maybe that dates or the locations can bump this up to a limited data set. And that's why we're here. We're here to help you review that stuff and make sure that the appropriate agreement is executed. So that way we can protect you and UT Southwestern.
Okay, and I have another one. Will agreements be tracked as part of Greenlight, since HRPP will take ownership of the process for most agreements?
As of right now, the agreements are not tracked as part of Greenlight, but we are internally tracking, especially for new studies, whether or not an agreement is required, because we want to make sure that we get the agreement processed as quickly as possible. So right now it is not. It is definitely possible that an agreement or the agreements process could be included in Greenlight in a future enhancement to EIRB and e-agreements.
Okay, thank you. Someone's asking if you will provide your responses to these great questions, and so I'll when we send out the listserv this afternoon, we'll include the questions with your responses so they have that information. I have another question. It says, can you provide guidance when Children's provides data? Are the instructions the same as UT Southwestern?
So we have talked with our affiliates, and if that data is coming over to UT Southwestern, so maybe the data existed inside the the children's EPIC environment, but then as part of a study you collected it and stored it and maintained it on UT Southwestern servers, then the UT Southwestern requirements will apply to this, and Children's agrees with our perspective that when agreements are required. So essentially the answer to that is yes, for the most part. If you're sending an agreement directly from, or sorry, sending data directly from Children's to an external institution, and UT Southwestern is not engaged on the study, then you'll want to make sure that you're checking with Children's Research Administration, because in those cases, Children's will be processing either the data transfer agreement or the data use agreement. The majority of the studies that we're going to be talking about are going to be studies where both Children's and UT Southwestern are both working on the study, and Children's defers to UT Southwestern to process those agreements.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
We're still seeing if any other questions do come through. Wait just a few more minutes. And while we wait, just want to let the research community know that the next Research Matters session will be held on November 16th. And we're just still going to give you guys a couple more minutes. Okay, Josh, do you have anything else you'd like to say?
Thank you all. We understand this is a big change and a big update, so if you have any questions, please reach out to us. We'd be more than happy to help out.
Thank you.